Sunday, September 16, before Felix. 5 days after Paul's transfer to Caesarea, a group of important Jewish leaders, the high priests, some members of the Sanhedrin, and a professional lawyer named Tertullus, came down from Jerusalem and formally laid before Felix their case against the apostle. We read that in Acts 24, verses 1 through to 9. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias went down to Caesarea with some of the elders and a lawyer named Tertullus, and they brought their charges against Paul before the governor. When Paul was called in, Tertullus presented his case before Felix. "We have enjoyed a long period of peace under you, and your foresight has brought about reforms in this nation. Everywhere and in every way, most excellent Felix, we acknowledge this with profound gratitude. But in order not to weary you further, I would request that you be kind enough to hear us briefly. We have found this man to be a troublemaker, stirring up riots among the Jews all over the world. He is a ringleader of the Nazarene sect, and even tried to desecrate the temple. So we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to learn the truth about all these charges we are bringing against him." The other Jews joined in the accusation, asserting that these things were true. This is the only trial in Acts in which the accusers employed a lawyer. In his speech, Tertullus tried an interesting strategy to win the governor's favour. It was simply not true that under Felix the Jews had enjoyed a long period of peace. In fact, no other governor had been so repressive and violent, and this repression generated an enormous antagonism among the Jews toward Roman rule. With a lot of ingenuity, Tertullus used the governor's own administrative policy to convince him that he would achieve political stability in this case, also only by means of severe repression. Then he went on to press 3 specific charges against Paul. 1, that Paul was an agitator who constantly was fomenting unrest among Jews throughout the empire, verse 5. 2, that he was a ringleader of the Nazarenes, verse 5, which implicated Christianity as a whole as a kind of disruptive movement. And 3, that he had attempted to defile the Jerusalem temple, verse 6. Question. Read Acts 24, verses 10 through to 19. How did Paul answer each one of these charges? Acts 24, beginning at verse 10. When the governor motioned for him to speak, Paul replied, "I know that for a number of years you have been a judge over this nation, so I gladly make my defence. You can easily verify that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. My accusers did not find me arguing with anyone at the temple, or stirring up a crowd in the synagogues, or anywhere else in the city. And they cannot prove to you the charges that they are now making against me. However, I admit that I worship the God of our ancestors as a follower of the way, which they call a sect. I believe everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets, and I have the same hope in God as these men themselves have, that there will be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man. After an absence of several years, I came to Jerusalem to bring my people gifts for the poor and to present offerings. I was ceremonially clean when they found me in the temple courts doing this. There was no crowd with me, nor was I involved in any disturbance. But there were some Jews from the province of Asia who ought to be here before you and bring charges if they have anything against me." 2 further points raised by Paul were devastating to the accuser's case. 1, the absence of the Asian witnesses in verses 18 and 19, which had the potential of rendering the trial invalid, and 2, the fact that the Jews there could speak only about Paul's hearing before the Sanhedrin the week before, and that's recorded in verse 20, or "These who are here should state what crime they found in me when I stood before the Sanhedrin." And as such, they had nothing to accuse him of except that he believed in the resurrection of the dead, Actually, in Acts 23:6, it says, "Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, 'My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead.'" Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, "That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you." At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked with him. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favour to the Jews, he left Paul in prison. And so he procrastinated. He was able to be bribed, and he was opportunistic. Paul had little chance of a fair hearing with someone like Felix. And to finish today, read Acts 24:16. "So I strive always to keep my conscience clear before God and man." Paul said that he strove always to have a conscience void of offence toward God and toward men. What does that mean? What, if anything, would you have to change in order to say the same thing?